The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Rome as preparations began for one of the most significant royal visits in recent Vatican history. King Charles III and Queen Camilla were about to embark on a journey that would bridge centuries of complex relationships between the British monarchy and the Catholic Church. The date was April 27th, 2024, and the world watched as history prepared to unfold within the sacred walls of Vatican City. The anticipation had been building for months. Vatican officials had been working tirelessly to ensure every detail was perfect for this momentous occasion. The last time a reigning British monarch had visited the Vatican was in 2014, when Queen Elizabeth II met with Pope Francis. Now, her son would continue this tradition of diplomatic dialogue between two of the world's most influential institutions. King Charles had always shown a deep respect for different faiths and cultures throughout his life. As the defender of the faith and supreme governor of the Church of England, his visit to the Vatican represented more than just diplomatic courtesy. It symbolized a commitment to interfaith dialogue and understanding that had become increasingly important in a world facing numerous challenges. The royal couple's journey to Rome began at sunrise from their residence at Clarence House. The king, dressed in a navy blue suit with a carefully chosen tie that reflected both British tradition and respect for the Vatican's customs, appeared thoughtful as he reviewed his notes for the historic meeting. Queen Camilla, elegant in a deep purple ensemble with a delicate silver brooch that had belonged to the late Queen Elizabeth II, radiated quiet confidence as she prepared for what would become one of the most photographed royal visits of the year. Their flight to Rome was aboard a specially configured aircraft that served as the royal transport. During the 3-hour journey, the king and queen were briefed extensively by their diplomatic team about the protocols, traditions, and significance of their upcoming meetings. The British ambassador to the Holy See, Chris Trott, had spent weeks coordinating with Vatican officials to ensure every aspect of the visit would run smoothly. As their plane descended toward Rome's Fiumicino airport, the Italian capital sparkled in the Mediterranean sunlight. The Eternal City had witnessed countless historic moments, but today would add another chapter to its remarkable story. The royal couple could see the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in the distance, a sight that had inspired pilgrims and visitors for centuries. Upon landing, King Charles and Queen Camilla were greeted by Italian government officials and members of the British Embassy staff. The motorcade that would transport them to the Vatican was carefully planned, taking a route that would allow some members of the Roman public to catch a glimpse of the visiting royals while maintaining appropriate security protocols. The drive through Rome's historic streets was a journey through layers of history. They passed ancient Roman ruins, Renaissance palaces, and Baroque churches, each telling part of the story of Western civilization. Queen Camilla was particularly moved by the sight of the Castel Sant'Angelo, the ancient fortress that had protected popes throughout history during times of crisis and conflict. As they approached Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign state, the significance of their visit became even more apparent. The Vatican had been the center of Catholic Christianity for nearly 2 millennia, and its influence on global affairs, culture, and spirituality could not be overstated. For a Protestant monarch to visit this sacred place represented a remarkable evolution in religious and diplomatic relations. The first stop was their accommodation at the British Embassy to the Holy See, located in the heart of Rome. This elegant building had hosted numerous British dignitaries over the years and provided the perfect base for their historic visit. The ambassador and his wife welcomed the royal couple with traditional British hospitality, offering tea and briefing them on the final details of their upcoming meetings. The embassy itself was a testament to British diplomatic presence in Rome. Its walls were adorned with portraits of previous British monarchs and photographs documenting decades of British-Vatican relations. Queen Camilla spent time examining historical documents that trace the evolution of these relationships, from times of tension to the current era of mutual respect and cooperation. That evening, as Rome's ancient streets filled with the warm glow of streetlights, King Charles stood on the embassy's terrace, gazing across the city toward the illuminated dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Tomorrow would bring meetings that could influence international relations, interfaith dialogue, and global efforts to address pressing challenges facing humanity. The king's longtime commitment to environmental conservation was expected to feature prominently in his discussions with Pope Francis. Both leaders had spoken passionately about climate change and the urgent need for global action to protect the planet for future generations. This shared concern had created a foundation for meaningful dialogue between the Anglican and Catholic churches on environmental stewardship. Queen Camilla had also prepared extensively for her role in the visit. As queen consort, she would participate in several meetings and ceremonial events, representing the modern British monarchy's commitment to public service and international cooperation. Her own charitable work, particularly in areas of literacy, domestic violence prevention, and animal welfare, aligned with many of the Vatican's social justice initiatives. The security arrangements for the visit were extraordinary. Vatican City's Swiss Guard, with their distinctive colorful uniforms and centuries-old traditions, worked alongside British security personnel and Italian authorities to ensure the safety of the royal visitors. Every entrance, every route, and every public appearance had been carefully planned and rehearsed. Vatican officials had spent weeks preparing for the visit, considering everything from protocol requirements to symbolic gestures that would enhance the meaning of the encounter. The choice of gifts to be exchanged, the specific locations for meetings, and even the seating arrangements had been discussed in detail to ensure the visit would achieve its diplomatic and spiritual objectives. Pope Francis himself had expressed genuine enthusiasm about meeting King Charles. The Pope, known for his humble approach to the papacy and his focus on social justice and environmental protection, had found common ground with the British monarch on numerous issues. Both men had spoken about the need for religious leaders to work together in addressing global challenges and promoting peace. As the evening wore on, final preparations continued at both the embassy and the Vatican. The king reviewed his talking points one final time, focusing particularly on areas where British and Vatican perspectives aligned: environmental protection, poverty reduction, interfaith dialogue, and conflict resolution. These shared concerns would provide the foundation for productive discussions that could influence global policy and religious cooperation. The media attention surrounding the visit was intense. Journalists from around the world had gathered in Rome to cover this historic encounter. The meeting between the head of the Anglican Church and the head of the Catholic Church represented a significant moment in Christian ecumenism and international diplomacy. Vatican photographers and British royal photographers worked together to plan coverage that would capture both the formal dignity of the occasion and the human moments that would help the global audience understand the significance of this encounter. Every photograph would be studied for symbolic meaning and diplomatic implications. The evening meal at the embassy was kept deliberately simple, reflecting both British traditions and the king's personal preferences for sustainable, locally sourced food. The conversation focused on the next day's events and the broader implications of the visit for British-Vatican relations and global interfaith cooperation. As midnight approached, Rome settled into a peaceful quiet, but excitement continued to build for the historic day ahead. King Charles and Queen Camilla retired to their quarters, knowing that tomorrow would bring moments that would be remembered for decades to come. The meeting between the British monarchy and the papal authority represented more than ceremonial diplomacy. It embodied hope for increased understanding and cooperation in an increasingly complex world. The final preparations were completed as dawn approached over the Eternal City. Vatican bells would soon ring to announce the beginning of a day that would add another remarkable chapter to the long history of relations between Britain and the Holy See. The world waited to witness this historic encounter between two of the most influential institutions in Western civilization. Security teams conducted final sweeps of all locations. Protocol officers reviewed ceremonial procedures one last time, and diplomatic staff prepared for a day that could influence international relations for years to come. Everything was ready for King Charles III and Queen Camilla to make their historic entrance into Vatican City, beginning a visit that would demonstrate the power of dialogue, respect, and shared commitment to serving humanity's highest aspirations. The stage was set for a historic encounter that would bridge centuries of complex relationships and point toward a future of increased cooperation and understanding between the Anglican and Catholic churches, between Britain and the Vatican, and between different faith communities working together to address the challenges facing our world. The morning of April 28th, 2024, dawned bright and clear over Vatican City as the Swiss Guard took their positions for one of the most significant papal audiences in recent memory. The distinctive yellow, blue, and red uniforms of the Vatican's ceremonial guards created a colorful backdrop against the ancient stone walls of St. Peter's Square as final preparations were completed for the arrival of King Charles III and Queen Camilla. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the royal motorcade departed from the British Embassy to the Holy See. The route through Rome's historic center had been carefully planned to balance security requirements with the opportunity for some Romans to witness this historic moment. Italian police lined the streets as the convoy moved through the ancient city, past monuments that had stood for millennia and witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Queen Camilla gazed out at the Roman crowds who had gathered along the route, many waving small British and Vatican flags. Children held handmade signs welcoming the royal couple, and elderly Romans crossed themselves as the motorcade passed, recognizing the spiritual significance of this encounter between the head of the Anglican Church and the leader of the Catholic faith. The approach to Vatican City through the Via della Conciliation offered a magnificent view of St. Peter's Basilica, its massive dome dominating the Roman skyline. Designed by Michelangelo and completed in 1590, the dome had watched over countless historic moments. But today, it would witness something truly special. The meeting between two Christian traditions that had been divided for centuries, but now sought common ground in facing global challenges. As their vehicles passed through the boundaries of Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign state, King Charles and Queen Camilla entered a realm where history, faith, and diplomacy intersected in unique ways. The Vatican's 121 acres contained more artistic treasures, spiritual significance, and political influence than perhaps any other place on earth. Their first stop was the courtyard of the Apostolic Palace, where they were greeted by Vatican officials dressed in traditional black cassocks with purple trim. The protocol for receiving visiting heads of state at the Vatican followed traditions established over centuries, but each visit was carefully customized to reflect the specific relationship between the Holy See and the visiting nation. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State and effectively its Prime Minister, personally welcomed the royal couple. His presence underscored the importance the Vatican placed on this visit and on British-Vatican relations more broadly. Cardinal Parolin had been instrumental in arranging the meeting and had worked closely with British diplomatic officials to ensure the visit would achieve its objectives. The walk through the Vatican's corridors toward the papal apartments was a journey through some of the world's greatest art. Frescoes by Raphael and other Renaissance masters adorned the walls, while priceless sculptures and tapestries displayed centuries of artistic achievement supported by the Catholic Church. Queen Camilla, with her deep appreciation for art and culture, was visibly moved by the beauty surrounding them. Swiss guards stood at attention throughout the papal palace, their halberds gleaming in the morning light streaming through ancient windows. These guards, recruited from Catholic cantons of Switzerland, had protected the Pope for over 500 years, and their presence added gravity and continuity to the proceedings. The final approach to Pope Francis's private study was through the most sacred corridors of the Apostolic Palace. Here, countless world leaders, saints, and dignitaries had walked before meetings that shaped history. The weight of this tradition was not lost on King Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing for moments when personal faith intersected with public duty. At exactly 11 a.m., the doors to the papal study opened, and Pope Francis emerged to greet his distinguished visitors. The 87-year-old pontiff, known for his warm personality and informal style, immediately put the royal couple at ease with his genuine smile and welcoming demeanor. His simple white cassock and silver pectoral cross contrasted sharply with the ornate surroundings, reflecting his commitment to papal simplicity. The first moments of their meeting were captured by Vatican and British photographers, images that would be studied and treasured for generations to come. The sight of the head of the Anglican Church and the head of the Catholic Church shaking hands represented a remarkable moment in Christian ecumenism and international relations. Pope Francis invited King Charles and Queen Camilla into his private study, a surprisingly modest room given its location at the heart of Catholic power. The walls were lined with books in multiple languages, and simple wooden furniture reflected the Pope's preference for humility over ostentation. A large crucifix dominated one wall, while photographs of the Pope with world leaders and ordinary people covered another. The private audience began with an exchange of gifts that had been carefully chosen for their symbolic significance. King Charles presented Pope Francis with a first edition of a book about environmental conservation, reflecting their shared concern for protecting the planet. The book's leather binding bore the royal coat of arms and included a personal inscription from the king expressing hope for continued cooperation on environmental issues. Queen Camilla's gift to the Pope was a collection of British poetry, including works by contemporary poets who had written about faith, hope, and social justice. The anthology was specially bound for this occasion and included poems that reflected the values both the monarchy and the papacy held dear: service to others, protection of the vulnerable, and the search for meaning in an increasingly complex world. Pope Francis's gifts to the royal couple were equally thoughtful. For King Charles, he presented a bronze medallion depicting St. Peter's Basilica, along with copies of his major encyclicals on environmental protection and social justice. These papal letters had influenced global discussions on climate change and economic inequality, topics that aligned closely with the king's own concerns. For Queen Camilla, the Pope offered a beautiful rosary made by artisans in the Vatican workshops, along with a special edition of his writings on the role of women in the modern world. The gesture acknowledged her position as queen consort and her significant charitable work, particularly in areas affecting women and children. With the formal gift exchange completed, the three leaders settled into comfortable chairs for what would become a wide-ranging and deeply meaningful conversation. The discussion began with their shared concerns about environmental protection and climate change, topics that had brought them together in spirit long before this physical meeting. King Charles spoke passionately about his decades of environmental activism, explaining how his early warnings about climate change had often been dismissed, but were now recognized as prophetic. He described his organic farming initiatives, his work to promote sustainable architecture, and his efforts to convince world leaders to take environmental threats seriously. Pope Francis responded with equal passion, describing his own environmental encyclical Laudato Si and explaining how he viewed environmental protection as a fundamental moral obligation. The Pope's perspective on integral ecology, the idea that environmental and social justice issues were inseparable, resonated strongly with the king's own holistic approach to environmental challenges. Queen Camilla contributed to the conversation by describing her work with literacy programs and explaining how education, particularly of women and children, was essential for building societies that could address environmental challenges effectively. Her perspective added an important dimension to their discussion about the connections between human development and environmental protection. The conversation naturally evolved to discuss their shared commitment to interfaith dialogue and religious cooperation. Both King Charles and Pope Francis had worked extensively to build bridges between different religious communities, recognizing that global challenges required unified responses that transcended traditional religious boundaries. Pope Francis described his meetings with Islamic leaders, Orthodox patriarchs, and leaders of other Christian denominations, emphasizing how much could be accomplished when religious communities work together rather than focusing on their differences. He praised King Charles's own interfaith initiatives and his efforts to promote understanding between different religious communities in Britain and the Commonwealth. King Charles responded by describing his vision of a monarchy that served all faith communities in Britain, not just Anglicans. He explained how his coronation ceremony had included representatives from multiple faiths and how he viewed his role as defender of the faith as including protection for all religious communities facing persecution or discrimination. The discussion of religious freedom and tolerance led naturally to conversations about global conflicts and the role religious leaders could play in promoting peace. Both leaders had spoken out against violence committed in the name of religion and had worked to promote dialogue in conflict zones around the world. Pope Francis described the Vatican's diplomatic efforts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and other conflict zones, emphasizing how patient dialogue and bridge building often achieved more than dramatic gestures. He praised the British government's humanitarian efforts and expressed hope for increased cooperation between Vatican and British diplomatic initiatives. The meeting also addressed the persecution of Christians and other religious minorities around the world. Both leaders had spoken out against religious persecution and had worked to support threatened communities. They discussed specific situations where their combined influence might help protect vulnerable religious communities. As their private audience continued, the conversation became increasingly personal. Pope Francis asked about King Charles's own spiritual journey and how his faith influenced his approach to monarchy. The king spoke candidly about how his Anglican faith shaped his understanding of service and his commitment to using his position to help others. Queen Camilla shared her own reflections on faith and public service, describing how her marriage to the king had deepened her understanding of the spiritual dimensions of royal duty. Her thoughtful comments impressed the Pope and demonstrated the depth of her commitment to the charitable and spiritual aspects of her role. The Pope, in turn, spoke about his own journey from Argentina to the Vatican and how his experience working with the poor in South America continued to influence his approach to the papacy. His stories of life in the slums of Buenos Aires resonated with the royal couple's own commitment to serving those in need. Their discussion of social justice issues revealed remarkable alignment in their values and priorities. All three leaders had worked extensively on behalf of the marginalized and vulnerable, and they found common ground in their commitment to fighting poverty, promoting education, and protecting human dignity. As the formal audience drew to a close, Pope Francis extended a special invitation to King Charles and Queen Camilla to join him for a brief tour of the Vatican Gardens. This gesture was particularly significant, as the papal gardens were typically reserved for the Pope's private reflection and were rarely open to visitors, even distinguished ones. The walk through the Vatican Gardens provided a peaceful conclusion to their intense discussions. Surrounded by ancient trees, beautiful flowers, and quiet pathways, the three leaders continued their conversation in a more relaxed setting. The gardens had provided sanctuary for popes for centuries and offered a perfect environment for reflection on the important topics they had discussed. As their time together concluded, Pope Francis blessed the royal couple and expressed his hope for continued cooperation between their institutions. The warmth and sincerity of their interactions had exceeded all expectations and created a foundation for enhanced collaboration between the Anglican and Catholic churches on issues of global importance. The significance of this historic meeting would resonate far beyond the walls of Vatican City, influencing religious dialogue, international diplomacy, and global efforts to address pressing challenges facing humanity. The personal connection established between these three remarkable leaders promised continued cooperation in service of the common good. Following their private audience with Pope Francis, King Charles and Queen Camilla were escorted through the magnificent corridors of the Apostolic Palace toward the Sistine Chapel, one of the most sacred and artistically significant spaces in the world. The afternoon sun streamed through ancient windows, casting ethereal light on the Renaissance masterpieces that lined their path. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, personally guided the royal couple through the papal apartments. At 90 years old, Cardinal Re embodied the living memory of the Catholic Church and had witnessed decades of historic papal audiences. His presence underscored the extraordinary nature of this visit and the deep respect the Vatican held for the British monarchy. The approach to the Sistine Chapel was a journey through some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. The Raphael rooms, with their stunning frescoes depicting scenes from history and scripture, provided a breathtaking backdrop for their walk. Queen Camilla paused frequently to admire the intricate details of these masterpieces, while King Charles reflected on how art and faith had intersected throughout history to inspire and elevate human civilization. The Swiss Guard contingent accompanying them moved with precision and dignity, their colorful uniforms a striking contrast against the muted tones of the ancient frescoes. These guards, many of whom were young men from Swiss Catholic families, took immense pride in their role protecting the Vatican's most distinguished visitors during such historic moments. As they approached the entrance to the Sistine Chapel, Cardinal Re explained the significance of this sacred space where papal elections had taken place for over 500 years. The chapel had witnessed moments that changed history, from the election of popes who led the Counter-Reformation to the selection of John XXII, who modernized the Catholic Church, and Francis himself, who had brought a new emphasis on social justice and environmental protection. The massive doors of the Sistine Chapel opened to reveal one of the world's most famous artistic spaces. Michelangelo's ceiling, painted between 1508 and 1512, spread overhead in magnificent detail, telling the story of creation, the fall of man, and the promise of redemption. The royal couple stood in reverent silence, overwhelmed by the beauty and spiritual power of this sacred space. Queen Camilla gazed upward at the famous scene of God giving life to Adam, one of the most recognizable images in Western art. The fresco had inspired countless visitors over the centuries, and its message about the divine nature of humanity resonated deeply with her own understanding of the sacred dignity of every human being. King Charles was particularly moved by Michelangelo's depiction of the Last Judgment on the altar wall. The massive fresco, completed much later in the artist's life, showed both the hope of salvation and the consequences of moral failure. As someone who had spent his life reflecting on duty, service, and moral responsibility, the king found profound meaning in these artistic representations of ultimate accountability. Cardinal Re explained how the Sistine Chapel served not only as an artistic treasure, but as the site where the College of Cardinals gathered in conclave to elect new popes. The famous chimney that announced papal elections to the world had sent up white smoke just 11 years earlier, when Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis, beginning a pontificate that would emphasize mercy, social justice, and environmental stewardship. The acoustics of the Sistine Chapel were remarkable, designed to carry the human voice clearly throughout the sacred space. Cardinal Re demonstrated this by offering a brief prayer in Latin, his voice resonating through the chapel and creating an atmosphere of profound reverence. The prayer, asking for God's blessing on the work of world leaders, seemed particularly appropriate for this historic visit. A small ceremony had been arranged within the Sistine Chapel to commemorate this unprecedented visit. Members of the papal choir, dressed in traditional white surplices, performed sacred music that had been specially selected to honor both British and Catholic musical traditions. The haunting beauty of Gregorian chant filled the chapel, creating an atmosphere of transcendent spirituality. The musical selection included Ave Verum Corpus by British composer William Byrd, a piece that bridged the gap between Anglican and Catholic musical traditions. Byrd had lived during the Elizabethan era, when Catholics faced persecution in England. Yet his music transcended religious division to speak to universal human longing for the divine. The choice was particularly meaningful given the day's themes of reconciliation and understanding. Queen Camilla was visibly moved by the performance, her eyes glistening with tears as the ancient melodies echoed through the sacred space. The music seemed to capture the spiritual significance of their visit, and the hope that religious communities could work together despite centuries of division and misunderstanding. King Charles stood with his head bowed throughout the musical performance, clearly affected by the combination of artistic beauty, spiritual significance, and historical weight that surrounded them. The moment represented everything he had hoped to achieve through this visit, a demonstration that different Christian traditions could find common ground while maintaining their distinctive identities. Following the ceremony in the Sistine Chapel, the royal couple was invited to participate in a special blessing ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica. The massive basilica, built over the tomb of St. Peter and completed in 1626, represented the spiritual heart of Catholic Christianity and welcomed millions of pilgrims each year from every continent. The walk from the Sistine Chapel to St. Peter's Basilica took them through the Vatican museums, home to one of the world's greatest art collections. Sculptures from ancient Rome stood alongside Renaissance paintings and modern works of art, all collected by the Catholic Church over nearly 2 millennia. The royal couple paused briefly to admire the Apollo Belvedere and the Laocoon, ancient sculptures that had inspired artists for centuries. Entering St. Peter's Basilica through a side entrance reserved for distinguished visitors, King Charles and Queen Camilla were immediately struck by the massive scale and overwhelming beauty of this sacred space. The basilica could hold 60,000 people and had hosted countless historic ceremonies, from papal coronations to the canonization of saints. The altar area of St. Peter's Basilica had been specially prepared for their blessing ceremony. Candles flickered on the papal altar, directly above the tomb of St. Peter, creating an atmosphere of sacred reverence. The famous baldachin designed by Bernini soared overhead, its bronze columns twisted in Baroque magnificence. Pope Francis joined them at the main altar for the blessing ceremony, accompanied by several cardinals and bishops who represented different aspects of the Church's global mission. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle from the Philippines spoke about the Catholic Church's work in Asia, while Cardinal Peter Turkson from Ghana described efforts to promote peace and development in Africa. The blessing ceremony began with readings from Scripture that emphasized themes of peace, reconciliation, and service to others. The first reading, from the prophet Isaiah, spoke of nations beating their swords into plowshares and learning war no more. The passage resonated deeply with the day's emphasis on cooperation and mutual understanding. The gospel reading, chosen personally by Pope Francis, came from the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the Beatitudes. The passage blessed peacemakers, those who hunger for justice, and those who show mercy to others. These themes perfectly captured the shared values that had brought the Anglican and Catholic churches together in common cause. Pope Francis delivered a brief homily that spoke directly to the significance of their meeting. He emphasized how Christians from different traditions could work together while respecting their differences, and he challenged all religious communities to focus on serving the poor and protecting the environment rather than dwelling on theological disagreements. The Pope's homily drew particularly on the example of St. Francis of Assisi, his namesake, who had sought to build bridges rather than walls, and who had shown that radical simplicity and love for creation could transform the world. This message resonated strongly with King Charles's own environmental commitments and his understanding of royal duty as service to others. The blessing ceremony concluded with Pope Francis offering a special papal blessing for King Charles and Queen Camilla, their work in service of the British people, and their efforts to promote understanding between different faith communities. The blessing was conducted in both Latin and English, acknowledging the linguistic traditions of both the Vatican and the British monarchy. As the ceremony concluded, the royal couple was invited to sign the Vatican's Distinguished Visitors Book, adding their names to a list that included every major world leader of the past century. King Charles wrote a message expressing gratitude for the warm welcome and hope for continued cooperation between their institutions in service of the common good. Queen Camilla's inscription emphasized her admiration for the Vatican's artistic treasures and spiritual significance, while expressing hope that their visit would contribute to greater understanding between different Christian communities. Her words reflected both personal conviction and diplomatic wisdom. The signing ceremony took place in the Vatican's Hall of Benedictions, a magnificent space overlooking St. Peter's Square. Through the great windows, they could see pilgrims and tourists from around the world gathering in the square, many hoping to catch a glimpse of the distinguished visitors or to receive a papal blessing. Vatican officials had arranged for a brief appearance on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, the same balcony from which new popes first greet the world and from which they deliver their most important messages. The opportunity to appear on this historic balcony was an extraordinary honor that emphasized the significance of their visit. The appearance on the balcony provided a perfect conclusion to their time in St. Peter's Basilica. Below them, St. Peter's Square filled with thousands of people who had gathered to witness this historic moment. The crowd included British tourists who had rushed to the Vatican when news of the royal visit spread, as well as pilgrims from around the world who understood the significance of this encounter. Pope Francis joined King Charles and Queen Camilla on the balcony, and together they waved to the enthusiastic crowd below. The sight of the Pope and the British monarch standing together sent a powerful message about the possibility of cooperation and understanding between different Christian traditions. The crowd's response was overwhelming, with sustained applause and cheers in multiple languages. British visitors sang "God Save the King," while Catholics in the crowd recited prayers and hymns. The moment perfectly captured the spirit of the entire visit, different traditions coming together in mutual respect and shared commitment to serving others. Photographers captured images that would become iconic representations of 21st century religious diplomacy. The pictures showed three remarkable leaders united in their commitment to peace, justice, and environmental protection, standing together above a crowd that represented the global nature of both British and Catholic influence. As they prepared to leave St. Peter's Basilica, Vatican officials presented King Charles and Queen Camilla with special commemorative medals struck specifically for this visit. The medals, designed by Vatican artisans, depicted St. Peter's Basilica on one side and included inscriptions in both Latin and English celebrating the friendship between the Anglican and Catholic churches. The day's events in Vatican City had exceeded all expectations, creating moments of genuine spiritual significance while advancing important diplomatic and religious objectives. The warmth and mutual respect displayed by all participants had demonstrated the potential for increased cooperation between institutions that had often been divided by history and doctrine. As evening approached, King Charles and Queen Camilla prepared to depart Vatican City with hearts full of gratitude and minds filled with new possibilities for collaboration. Their historic visit had created a foundation for enhanced cooperation between the Anglican and Catholic churches and had shown the world what could be accomplished when religious leaders focused on their shared values rather than their differences. The golden light of early evening bathed Rome as King Charles and Queen Camilla began their final activities at the Vatican, but their historic visit was far from over. Pope Francis had extended a special invitation for the royal couple to participate in a private evening Vesper service in the Vatican's Pauline Chapel, one of the most exclusive and sacred spaces within the papal apartments. The Pauline Chapel, built by Pope Paul III in the 16th century, served as the Pope's private chapel and was rarely open to visitors. Its intimate size and exquisite decoration made it perfect for personal prayer and reflection. The walls featured frescoes by Michelangelo depicting the conversion of St. Paul and the crucifixion of St. Peter, masterpieces that few people beyond papal officials had ever seen. As they entered the Pauline Chapel, King Charles and Queen Camilla were struck by the profound sense of history and spirituality that permeated the sacred space. Unlike the grand public areas of the Vatican, this chapel felt deeply personal and contemplative, providing the perfect setting for quiet reflection on the day's remarkable events. The evening Vespers service was conducted by Cardinal Luis Ladaria, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, one of the Vatican's most senior theological officials. His presence demonstrated the importance the Catholic Church placed on this historic visit and its potential impact on future Anglican-Catholic relations. The service began with the lighting of candles as the sun set over Rome, creating an atmosphere of timeless reverence. The ancient ritual of evening prayer had been observed by Christians for nearly 2,000 years, connecting this moment to countless generations of believers who had sought God's presence as day turned to night. Gregorian chant filled the small chapel as a select group of Vatican singers who performed the traditional evening prayers. The haunting melodies, unchanged for over a millennium, seemed to transport the royal couple beyond the immediate moment to participate in the eternal worship that had echoed through Christian history. Pope Francis joined the service midway through, taking his place in the simple wooden stall reserved for the Pope's personal prayer. His presence transformed the evening vespers into something unprecedented. The head of the Catholic Church praying alongside the Supreme Governor of the Church of England in one of the Vatican's most sacred spaces. Queen Camilla was deeply moved by the service, later describing it as one of the most spiritual experiences of her life. The combination of ancient music, sacred art, and the presence of such remarkable religious leaders created an atmosphere of transcendent worship that touched her heart profoundly. The prayers offered during the service included special intercessions for world peace, environmental protection, and unity among Christian churches. These themes perfectly reflected the conversations that had taken place throughout the day and emphasized the shared concerns that had brought these religious leaders together. As the Vesper service concluded, Pope Francis invited King Charles and Queen Camilla to join him for a private dinner in his papal apartments. This extraordinary gesture of hospitality demonstrated the personal warmth that had developed between these leaders and their genuine commitment to building lasting relationships. The papal dining room was surprisingly modest, reflecting Pope Francis's preference for simplicity over ostentation. The table was set with elegant but understated Vatican china, and the meal featured traditional Italian dishes prepared with ingredients sourced from the Vatican's own gardens and from local Roman suppliers committed to sustainable agriculture. The dinner conversation was relaxed and wide-ranging, touching on topics from their shared love of gardening to their concerns about global poverty and environmental degradation. Pope Francis described his own vegetable garden in the Vatican, while King Charles shared stories about his organic farming initiatives at Highgrove and other royal properties. Queen Camilla contributed to the conversation by describing her literacy programs and explaining how education, particularly of women and children in developing countries, was essential for addressing global challenges. Her passion for this work impressed the Pope, who shared similar concerns about empowering marginalized communities. The meal itself was a celebration of sustainable cuisine, with each dish chosen to reflect the environmental values that all three leaders shared. Local vegetables, sustainably caught fish from the Mediterranean, and organic wines from papal estates created a menu that was both delicious and ethically conscious. During the dinner, Pope Francis presented King Charles with a specially bound copy of his environmental encyclical Laudato Si that had been personally inscribed with a message of hope for continued collaboration on environmental protection. The encyclical had influenced global discussions about climate change and had been praised by environmental leaders around the world. For Queen Camilla, the Pope offered a beautiful illuminated manuscript created by Vatican artisans that contained prayers and readings focused on service to others and care for creation. The manuscript, bound in leather and decorated with gold leaf, represented centuries of Vatican artistic tradition while addressing thoroughly contemporary concerns. The royal couple reciprocated by presenting the Pope with a collection of photographs documenting environmental restoration projects supported by the Prince's Trust and other royal charities. The images showed reforestation efforts, renewable energy installations, and sustainable agriculture projects that demonstrated the practical application of the environmental principles they all shared. As the dinner continued, the conversation turned to the broader implications of their historic meeting. All three leaders recognized that their encounter had created new possibilities for cooperation between the Anglican and Catholic churches on issues of global importance. Pope Francis suggested the establishment of a formal dialogue group that would bring together Anglican and Catholic leaders regularly to discuss environmental protection, poverty reduction, and other shared concerns. This proposal excited King Charles, who had long believed that religious communities needed to work together more effectively to address global challenges. Queen Camilla proposed that their respective charitable organizations explore opportunities for collaboration, particularly in areas affecting women and children. She envisioned partnerships that could leverage the global reach of both Anglican and Catholic institutions to maximize their impact on communities in need. The discussion of practical cooperation led to specific commitments for follow-up actions. Vatican officials agreed to explore partnerships with British charities working on environmental protection, while royal household representatives committed to investigating opportunities for collaboration with Catholic development organizations. As the evening progressed, the conversation became increasingly personal. Pope Francis shared stories from his youth in Argentina and his early work with the poor, while King Charles described how his environmental consciousness had developed over decades of observation and study. Queen Camilla spoke movingly about how her role as queen consort had deepened her understanding of public service and her commitment to using her position to help others. Her sincerity and dedication impressed the Pope, who expressed admiration for her charitable work and her support for the king's environmental initiatives. The dinner concluded with the Pope offering a special blessing for the royal couple's continued work in service of the British people and the global community. The blessing, delivered in both Latin and English, asked for divine guidance in their efforts to promote peace, protect the environment, and serve those most in need. Following dinner, Pope Francis invited his guests to join him on the papal balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square for a final private moment together. The square below was beautifully illuminated, and the dome of St. Peter's Basilica glowed against the night sky, creating a scene of timeless beauty and spiritual significance. Standing on the papal balcony, the three leaders reflected on the day's events and their implications for the future. The personal bonds that had formed between them during their meetings promised continued collaboration and mutual support for their shared objectives. The view from the papal balcony encompassed not only St. Peter's Square, but much of Rome beyond, a city that had witnessed the rise of Christianity and the development of Western civilization. The perspective seemed to emphasize the historical significance of their encounter and its potential impact on the future of interfaith dialogue. As their time on the balcony concluded, Pope Francis presented King Charles and Queen Camilla with papal medallions that had been blessed specifically for their visit. These medallions, crafted by Vatican artisans, would serve as permanent reminders of their historic encounter and the commitments they had made to work together for the common good. The final moments of their visit were spent in the papal library, where Pope Francis showed them rare manuscripts and documents that traced the history of Anglican-Catholic relations over the centuries. Some documents recorded periods of conflict and misunderstanding, while others celebrated moments of cooperation and mutual respect. One particularly significant document was a letter from Henry VIII to Pope Clement VII, written during the early stages of the English Reformation. The letter's presence in the papal archives demonstrated how even the most difficult periods in Anglican-Catholic relations had been preserved as part of the historical record. Another treasure document was correspondence between Pope John XEI and Archbishop of Canterbury Geoffrey Fisher from the 1960s, when both leaders were working to improve relations between their churches during the Second Vatican Council. These letters showed how previous generations of religious leaders had laid the groundwork for the cooperation being celebrated during this historic visit. Pope Francis emphasized how much progress had been made in Anglican-Catholic relations since the Second Vatican Council and expressed hope that their meeting would accelerate this positive trend. He particularly praised the theological dialogue that had taken place between Anglican and Catholic scholars over recent decades. As their visit drew to a close, King Charles expressed his profound gratitude for the warmth and hospitality they had received throughout their time at the Vatican. He emphasized how much the visit had meant to him personally and how it had strengthened his commitment to interfaith dialogue and cooperation. Queen Camilla added her own thanks, particularly for the opportunity to experience the Vatican's artistic treasures and spiritual atmosphere. She described how the visit had deepened her understanding of the Catholic faith and her appreciation for the dedication of those who serve the Church. The final ceremony of their visit was the signing of a joint statement that would be released to the global media. The statement emphasized their shared commitment to environmental protection, poverty reduction, interfaith dialogue, and conflict resolution. It represented a formal commitment to continued cooperation between the Anglican and Catholic churches on issues of global importance. The statement also acknowledged the historical divisions between their churches while expressing hope for a future characterized by increased understanding and collaboration. It specifically mentioned their commitment to working together on environmental protection, recognizing that the climate crisis required unified action from all religious communities. As King Charles and Queen Camilla prepared to depart Vatican City, they were escorted to their waiting motorcade by the same Vatican officials who had welcomed them that morning. The Swiss Guard stood at attention throughout the papal palace, their colorful uniforms a final reminder of the pageantry and tradition that had surrounded their historic visit. The journey through Vatican City toward their departure point provided one last opportunity to appreciate the beauty and significance of their surroundings. The illuminated dome of St. Peter's Basilica dominated the Roman skyline, while the ancient walls of Vatican City enclosed centuries of Christian history and artistic achievement. Their departure for Vatican City marked the end of one of the most significant papal audiences in recent memory, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Anglican-Catholic relations. The personal relationships formed during this visit promised continued dialogue and cooperation on issues of global importance. The international media coverage of their visit had been extensive and overwhelmingly positive, with commentators praising the warmth of the encounters and the substantive discussions that had taken place. The images of King Charles, Queen Camilla, and Pope Francis working together sent a powerful message about the possibility of religious cooperation in addressing global challenges. As their motorcade departed Vatican City and headed toward their final engagements in Rome, King Charles and Queen Camilla carried with them memories of extraordinary encounters and commitments to continued collaboration with the Catholic Church. Their historic visit had created new possibilities for cooperation and demonstrated the potential for religious leaders to work together in service of humanity's highest aspirations. The legacy of their visit would extend far beyond the ceremonial aspects to include practical cooperation on environmental protection, poverty reduction, and interfaith dialogue. The personal bonds formed during their meetings promised sustained collaboration and mutual support for their shared objectives in serving others and protecting the planet for future generations.